Hello, my name is Aviva, and today I wanted to share with you all of the books that I have read in the second half of August. I did make a mid-month wrap-up this month, so if you did miss that video and you wanted to see everything that I read in the first half of the month, I will make sure to have a link for it down in the description below. But either way, today I'm just going to pick up right where I left off and share with you all of my thoughts on all of the books that I have read in the past 2 weeks or so. So happens to be at the end of my mid-month wrap-up, I did quickly share with you a little bit about the Bailey Brothers Companion Series by Claire Kinsley. So happens to be, I think I had read book 1 at the time that I filmed that video, and I was in the middle of reading book 2, but I never ended up getting to share with you what I ended up thinking about it, especially because these two books follow the same couple. The rest of the series is like complete standalones. You're just following like a different brother in each book, and they each get their own romance, but happens to be book 1 and book 2, you are following the same couple, and you definitely have to read to the end of book 2 to get their happily ever after, because book 1 ends up on a cliffhanger. But book 1 is really tiny. It's kind of just like an origin story, kind of like a prequel, a very like short beginning to their story and how they came to be where they are at the beginning of their real story, which is like, you know, their full-on book. But either way, this starts off with a childhood best friends lovers scenario. These two people, they grew up next door to each other. She was kind of always like the girl next door, and they both really liked each other, but never thought that the other felt the same way, so they never made their move. Very classic childhood best friends lovers scenario. Like, as they got older, they started dating other people, and they kind of like slowly grew apart. And at the beginning of this book, they are now in college, and she's coming home for the summer, and basically she is now single and he is now single, so he decides to finally make his move before she ends up going back at the end of the summer to college and meeting somebody else. So that is kind of more or less what you get to follow in this story, and you kind of get to see them get together, kind of be happy for a little bit, but at the end of this book, something happens that ends up pulling them apart for 7 years, and then you jump to their real story, which is Fighting for Us, where you get to see them 7 years later trying to make their, you know, relationship work of sorts. And happens to be the things that happened in that 7 years really messed both of them up in different ways, and you're dealing with two very damaged characters. He is way more damaged than her, but like basically they're still both dealing with things, dealing with the repercussions of the past 7 years, and he kind of feels like, you know, he is too messed up to be with her, so he keeps pushing her away, but she keeps fighting for them because she's like, no, we're gonna make this work. I waited for you this entire time, and like, you know, you're my soulmate, we're gonna be together. And basically she doesn't give up on him, and she tries to help him through everything that he's dealing with. And basically it is just a really, really good story about two damaged characters. And happens to be the Bailey Brothers Companion Series is about a bunch of brothers, so you get to really get like into their family, get to see all of the brothers and everything going on. There's like a lot of like, you know, pranks going on in this small town, and like, you know, there's a lot of different things and elements, and basically there's a lot going on, but somehow it just all really like mushed together very well, very seamlessly. And I just really loved every single thing about this story overall. And if you're a fan of damaged characters, I definitely would recommend checking this one out, because like all around the board, for every single possible reason, I really did love everything about this couple's story. So definitely would recommend books 1 and book 2 in the Bailey Brothers Companion Series. But either way, after this, I did slowly get through a little bit more of the Bailey Brothers Companion Series over the past, you know, end of August or whatever, and I did continue with Unraveling Him, which was book 3. And in this one, you're following one of that guy's brothers, and he happens to be like a grumpy loner. Like, he lives in a cabin in the woods, and he owns like a mechanic shop, doesn't really talk to anybody, very like, you know, on his own sort of thing. And he's going to end up having a relationship with a different mechanic's daughter. Like, he kind of doesn't really like this other mechanic, but then the daughter kind of comes to him and being like, look, I have something that you need and you have something that I need. Can we make a deal and like, you know, help each other out? And he basically can't say no to her offer, so they end up, you know, going on a road trip together to like, you know, do a bunch of stuff, and then they're gonna end up like being forced proximity, and like, you know, there's a one bed trope, and there's like, you know, a lot of different good things going on in this book. And I honestly really did enjoy the general storyline of the book. Like, I think that it was a lot of fun. You still got the small town vibes, you got the grumpy sunshiness, you got a lot of like fun scenarios and things along those lines. And the only thing that I really had to complain about for this book was that it was instant attraction, which always ends up ruining a romance for me. Like, that is one of like my biggest things that I like to avoid, and I didn't really know that about the general theme of the Bailey Brothers Companion Series, is that they seem to all be instant attraction, minus the first one, which was like a childhood best friends lovers, which just, it doesn't work out that way, you know, like they grew up together, so it's different. But in this book specifically, it was instant attraction, and I'm just not a fan of that. And I didn't absolutely love the girl in this book, but like, she wasn't horrible, but like, I just like, I wasn't really connecting to her. And then on top of that, it was instant attraction, and even though I really enjoyed the general gist of the story, like it was a fun time to read about, I wasn't so into the romance. So I didn't end up loving this book, but honestly, it wasn't that horrible. I can't remember what I ended up rating it, like maybe like 4 stars or so, because I did really thoroughly enjoy my time reading it, even though I wasn't completely invested in the romance. So yeah, more or less, I liked the book, but if you don't like instant attraction, then I'd probably say to just like not bother with this one. But more or less, it was a solid story. So that was Unraveling Him by Claire Kinsley. And then happens to be, I also did end up reading the 4th book in the series, which was Rushing In. So in this book, you're following this girl who her life kind of like fell apart. So she decides to move in with her father, who lives in this small town where the Bailey brothers live. And he is the fire chief of the town. And happens to be on her way in, she ends up like driving in and hitting somebody. And who do you know she hits? The main guy in this story, obviously, who is one of her father's firefighters. So it's kind of like a boss's daughter sort of scenario, and happens to be she ends up breaking his leg. So he is a very outgoing guy. Like, he's a firefighter, he's like an adrenaline junkie sort of thing, and because he is in a, you know, a cast and everything like that, he is having a really hard time keeping himself entertained. So he ends up just like, you know, propositioning her, being like, hey, do you want me to be your friend? Like, I could show you around town. Like, I know that you're kind of off limits because like you're my boss's daughter, so I won't make a move, but I have nothing better to do and you don't know anybody here, so, you know, we can help each other, you know? So that is more or less like, you know, what ends up happening with their storyline. And I liked, again, the small town vibe, the general gist of the storyline. I thought that it was a fun story, but what I didn't like about this book was the romance. First of all, it was very heavy on instant attraction, even more heavy than the previous book. And what I didn't like about it was that it was very superficial, very like lust-filled, like very hormone-filled. Like, it was kind of like a strangers to friends with benefits to lover situation, and it just didn't really work for me. I like a little bit of a deeper connection, and this was very, very surface level to me. And I don't know if I said this yet, but she was very shy. She was like a writer, and I liked that aspect of her. Like, I thought that both characters were really good in their own way. They kind of like, you know, how do you say it? Like, not counteracted each other, but they were like opposites attract sort of thing, you know? And what I didn't like about her, though, was that she had this weird, this is so random and it sounds so small and like unimportant, but it really was a big thing for me in this story. The thing is that she was very shy and a little bit awkward, a little bit weird. And she had this weird thing that like anytime that she was like anxious or like in a room full of people or like, you know, in a hypersensitive situation, she would get aroused, like very, very aroused. And basically that ended up like pushing their, you know, relationship a little bit. Like they were at a party and she like hardly knew this guy. And then she like randomly told him that, and then basically they're gonna end up starting to hook up because like he was gonna help her with her problem sort of thing. And then like that's kind of how their friends with benefits thing like started to go. And it was just a very like sex heavy book instead of like a relationship deep, you know, like connection sort of book. And it wasn't necessarily extremely like steamy or anything like that. I think I gave it like a 3, maybe a 3.25. Like, it was pretty heavy on the sex, but not like a sex filled book. It was more of just like a relationship sex filled book, like very surface level, very lust filled relationship. Like, I'm attracted to you, so I want to sleep with you, and then I'm slowly gonna fall for you because we've slept together so much, you know? Like, and that's just not my type of story. And it really sucked because I really did like this couple. Like, I really did like the ideas of the book and the way that the book was going. I love the Bailey brothers. Like, I really like the vibe of, you know, the small town and the story and everything like that. It's just like the romances keep disappointing me. So I didn't end up loving this book. I did end up giving it a 3 stars, but I still do plan on continuing on with the series because I have 2 books left, and hopefully those 2 might not be instant attraction, or at least not instant attraction in the way that it's really going to bother me. So I'm going to cross my fingers for those. But either way, yeah, that is how far I ended up getting with the Bailey Brothers series as of the end of August. But anyway, after that, I also did end up continuing with my Shadowhunter universe sort of reread thing for the past like 2 months or so. I don't even remember when I started it, but I have been slowly rereading all the Shadowhunter books. I did skip the Clockwork series, like the historical romance series, and I did skip the Last Hour series because those are like kind of like my least favorite, even though I don't mind the Clockwork series. I just like wasn't down for the historicalness of it. So I started with the Mortal Instruments series, and I had finished that, and then I don't remember when, but probably 2 weeks ago, I ended up starting the Dark Artifices series, and I did end up finishing all of these books that are in my hands. So I did read the entire Dark Artifices series, and I was able to finish Ghosts from the Shadow Market. And happens to be these 4 books are my 4 favorite books out of the entire Shadowhunter universe. So I really did have a great time rereading these books. I did read them via audio, and I enjoyed the audiobooks, had a great time with these. I'm very sad that I'm now done with it because the Ghosts from the Shadow Market is the last book that I was planning on reading. everything from this universe. So yeah, this was a great time, but now after all of these months, I am finally done with it. So that is that. And then happens to be also throughout the rest of August, I did end up finishing up the Becker Brothers companion series. So in the first half of August, I had read the first book, and then I read the last 3 over the past couple of weeks. And overall, I did really enjoy the series. Like, happens to be in book 1, you basically find out that, like, you know, these kids, they all work at this whiskey distillery in their small town. Like, their grandfather had like founded it with this other founder, like that is another big family in this small town. And happens to be when the grandfathers died, they didn't end up leaving a will. So the entire distillery ended up going to, you know, this other family. And because of that, they like this, the Becker brothers have been feuding with that family this entire time, but they all still work at the distillery to, like, you know, keep their legacy going, sort of thing. Like, it's a tiny town, like everyone works at the distillery, and their family is basically like one of the founders. So they work there even though they now don't own it. And happens to be like 9 or so years ago, their father was working there as well, and he ended up like dying in a fire. And it was very, like, you know, sketchy and everything like that. So throughout this entire series, you're kind of slowly following the mystery of like what happened to his father, and like, you know, was it an accident? Was it not an accident? Because he was like the only person that died in the one fire that the distillery ever had, and like, you know, the entire history of them being open and everything like that. So throughout all 4 books, that mystery was slowly being, like, you know, solved and everything like that. And I really did enjoy seeing that overall in the series. But happens to be like, I loved book 1 so much, I gave it an easy 5 stars. But then every single book that I read after that ended up going downhill, even though I still loved the vibe of the series. Like, I loved the family overall, I loved the distillery sort of aspect, I loved the small town, but happens to be each romance ended up just, like, you know, getting worse and worse for me. So happens to be book 2, you are following this guy named Logan, and he's going to end up having a romance with his boss's daughter, who is the daughter of the family that, like, you know, his family is feuding with. So happens to be she's going to start working at the distillery, and he is going to be in charge of like training her and everything like that. So very forced proximity situation, kind of like nerdy good guy with a rebellious bad girl sort of thing. And I actually really did enjoy this romance, and even though I didn't love it as much as I loved book 1, I still really did thoroughly like the story. I liked the vibe of it, I liked both characters, everything was really good. It had that forbidden aspect, like they wanted to be together but their families would never approve of it, so they had to hide it and everything like that. And there were a couple of other things going on in the story, obviously, like slowly you know, solving the father's mystery and everything like that. Like, that continued with it, and I really liked where it was going. And the only thing that I really had to complain about for this book was that ending catalyst, like the whole ending where like everything blows up before they can make it like officially, you know, happily ever after. I thought it was a little bit over dramatized, and I kind of saw it coming the entire time. And the thing is, the characters saw it coming the entire time. Like, there was a couple of issues that were happening, and both characters were like, oh, I think that it's going to go this way, I think it's going to go this way, and then it ended up going this way, and then they both ended up blowing up and, like, you know, making the situation so much more intense than I thought it had to be, because like you saw it coming from a mile away. Why are you so surprised by this, you know? So I was kind of like a little bit like, okay, I thought it was a little bit like whatever, the ending, but then the ending I really did like. So that's my really only complaint for this book. Besides for that little hiccup, I really did thoroughly enjoy this story. So this one went well, but then happens to be, I also ended up reading the 3rd book, which is Manhattan, and I did not end up loving this one as much. So this is a childhood best friends to lover scenario with an unrequited love sort of thing. These 2 people, they became best friends when they were like really little kids, and she has always had a massive crush on him, but he never saw her that way, so she never really, like, you know, said anything about it. And basically when they're older, he ends up getting a girlfriend and kind of like cuts her out of his life, because like the girlfriend was very uncomfortable with her being around and everything like that. So for the 2 or so years that he was with this girl, they weren't really friends or anything like that. And then this girl ends up breaking his heart, and she ends up going and doing her own thing, leaves the story, and now this guy is heartbroken, and his best friend from when he was a kid ends up coming back into his life and trying to make him happy again and better, and like, you know, just giving him a good time and everything like that. So it was a very cute story in that sense, and I kind of really did have a fun time reading it. Like, there was a lot of fun scenes, like she kept like doing things to try and make him happy and excited again and everything like that, and I really liked it. What I didn't like about the story was the actual basis of the story, and I didn't realize that it was bothering me until I kept reading it. I kept getting further into the book and kept getting, like, you know, more invested in the story. And why I didn't like that was because at the beginning of the book, he was still depressed and like pining after his ex-girlfriend. Like, he was still like very much much in love with his ex-girlfriend. And then this girl who has been in love with him like for years basically comes into his life, and all of a sudden his like eyes open and he starts realizing that like his best friend is actually a girl, and like he's going to start like reluctantly falling for her, but he's kind of still in love with his ex-girlfriend. And that is what I didn't like. And because of that scenario, he ended up making like a lot of mistakes here and there, and he kept like hurting her even though he didn't realize he was hurting her in the moment. And he basically had a lot of like realizations to come through in this book, and I thought that it was done really well. Like there was no real like issues with this book. I just didn't really love him in this story because of the actual like basis of what his story was about. Like the story starts off where he was still in love with his ex-girlfriend, and you basically had to watch him fall out of love with it and then in love with his, you know, best friend. And it went well the way that it went, but I just didn't really love, you know, how that played out, and like the fact that he was in love with his ex-girlfriend for like 3/4 of the book. So it just didn't really personally work for me. But like if that sounds like something that like you'd be very into, I do think that this book would be really, really good for the right sort of reader. So yeah, that was more or less the story of Manhattan. And then happens to be the last book is Old Fashioned. And this is is she a single mom? I honestly cannot remember. She might be a single mom. Basically, she's recently divorced and she's going to end up getting a new job as like, you know, the athletic trainer for the high school's football team. And she's going to end up having a romance with the coach of this high school's football team, who is the last Becker brother. And it was a solid romance. There was like a lot going on because like she was recently divorced, and her ex-husband was like, you know, the police, the head of the police, like the sheriff or something like that in the town. And like, you know, he was very abusive and like stuff along those lines. And she was trying to like get out of the marriage sort of thing, and he wasn't really letting her go. And like, there was a lot of like, you know, interesting dynamics going on in the book. And it was pretty okay. But what I didn't love about this book so much was that because it was the last book in the series, you were kind of finally finishing up the story that was slowly happening throughout all 4 books about the mystery about the father. And what I didn't love about the book was that I felt like the first half of the story was very heavy on like building up the romance, and then the second half of the story was very heavy on like them finishing this mystery about the father. And I just thought that it wasn't very much balanced out so well. Like I didn't really love the romance for like a couple of reasons. Like I just found it to be like very like lackluster, like very like quick and like not that impressive. And I was honestly like very excited for this brother the entire time. So I ended up being very disappointed. And even though I did really like how the ending happened, like the whole thing with the father and like the conclusion to the series overall, like I loved how that happened. I feel like the romance in this book ended up kind of getting put on the side burner to basically like finish up the series story, if that makes sense. And because of that, I didn't end up loving this book because I still wanted a really good romance, even though, yeah, I wanted to see the ending to like, you know, the series overall. I was unfortunately a little bit disappointed by the romance. So didn't end up loving this one. But again, I'm still happy that I read it because I really liked seeing the conclusion to all 4 books. So yeah, that was more or less the general gist of the Becker Brothers series by Candy Steiner. But anyway, after that, I did also read this standalone called Down Too Deep by J. Daniels. So this is actually a double single parent book. Both of these people are single parents, and they're going to end up having a romance. Basically, this guy's wife had died 2 years ago, and he did not take it very well. He is still very much dealing with everything that happened to his wife and how all of that played out. And he is now he had like a newborn baby when the mother had died. So basically he like hasn't been really like taking care of the kid very well. He kind of like, you know, gave it to the grandparent, like his parents of sorts, like the grandparents. And for the past 2 years, he's kind of just been like very heavy on work, not very heavy on being a parent. And basically at the beginning of the story, the grandparents are like, you got to take your kid back. Like we want to retire. We want to be grandparents, not parents. So he basically freaks out. He's like, what the hell am I going to do? I need to find a babysitter, but he couldn't really find a babysitter. So he kind of like keeps bringing the kid to his work every day, and he owns a restaurant. So at the beginning of the story, this girl ends up coming into the restaurant and like meeting the guy and seeing the baby walking around the restaurant and everything like that. So she kind of ends up offering to like babysit the kid because she realizes that like, you know, he kind of needs a little bit of help. And she is a single mom herself. She has 2 twins, and she works from home because it's like summer right now. So she's going to be watching her kids all summer while working from home. So she's like, I could totally watch your kid. Like no big deal. I'm doing it already, you know, and like I love kids. So basically he's like, oh my God, you are literally saving my life. So that is more or less like the gist of the story. I wouldn't necessarily necessarily call it like a nanny romance, but it is like a babysitter romance of sorts. And basically, I really did thoroughly enjoy this book. I will say that throughout the entire story, there were a little bit of like ups and downs for me of like, at some moments I was a little more bored than other moments, but it was kind of more just because like the entire story was like very mundane, like kind of just watching like everyday things. Like he wasn't a really good parent, like not a good parent, but he didn't really know how to be a parent. So slowly throughout the book, like she was slowly teaching him how to like take care of his kid, and like you were seeing a lot of babysitting moments and them just like slowly building up this relationship, him kind of dealing with like, you know, turning to be an actual parent and like dealing with like, you know, his past with his ex-wife, not ex-wife, his wife who died and everything like that. But either way, there was a lot of good stuff going on in this book. I did end up giving it a 5 stars, but that is mostly because of the ending. I loved how it ended. Like, I thought that it just really came full circle, and like the ending just like brought the whole thing home for me. And by the end of it, I was absolutely in love with the book. Even though the entire time I was reading it, it was a little bit more of like a 4-star read for me. Like, not a bad book whatsoever, but the whole time I was reading it, I wasn't necessarily like feeling 5 stars. But by the time that I got to the end of it, I'm like, oh my God, that book was amazing. So I really did love it. It was very different than things that I've read in the past. Like, I just thought that it was a little bit of a unique storyline, the way that it was paced out. Like, it just didn't feel like it followed the regular, what is it called? Like a template for a regular romance book. Like, after you read a lot of romance books, they all start feeling the same. And I felt like this one was a little bit out of the box. So overall, absolutely love this book. Definitely would recommend it if you're into single parents, especially if you like when both of them are single parents. So yeah, that was Down Too Deep by J. Daniels. But anyway, after that, I did also end up reading Flawless by Elsie Silver. And unfortunately, I did not end up loving this book. So in this book, you're following this guy who is a professional bull rider, and he kind of got in a little bit of trouble with the media, and he's going to end up having a PR person follow him around and basically babysit him for the next couple of months. And happens to be, it is the his like manager's daughter. Like, she is about to like, you know, take over her father's business and everything like that. So this is kind of like her first job, like taking care of this high profile client and kind of like, you know, being like in very close proximity with him, like sleeping in the same house with him for the next couple of months, making sure he doesn't sleep with anybody or like getting into any trouble with the media and everything along those lines. So very classic storyline, and honestly, it was not that bad. And I know that a lot of people are really loving this book, and I understand why you're loving it, because it kind of had a lot of really good things going for it. It had like, I can't even remember off the top of my head, but it kind of just had a lot of classic things that people seem to really love, all mushed together in one book. And that is kind of what I didn't love about the story. Like, it kind of reminds me a lot about like a lot of other books that I've read. Like, first, right off the bat, it reminded me a lot of Wrecked by Lauren Asher, which is the 3rd book in the Dirty Air Companion series, and it literally had the same storyline of like, this guy, he got in trouble with the media, so a PR manager is going to end up following him around for a while, and then like, they're gonna end up having a romance, and she's gonna try to like fix him and everything like that. And there was just like, I don't know, that was like the only one I could think of off the top of my head right now. But as I was reading it, it just reminded me of a lot of different stories jumbled together, and that's a good thing. But also, like, I guess I wasn't into it. Like, I was kind of expecting a little bit more from the book because I was seeing all these good things, and then I just like was disappointed. Like, yeah, there was a one-bed trope, and there was a very like protective, jealous sort of hero. Very, was it Grumpy Sunshine? I don't know about that, but basically, like, he was very like, he was a very like classic hero, what a lot of people like to read. And there wasn't that much wrong with the book. I just didn't really connect with the romance. I wasn't really impressed by it, and it was very like mediocre for me all around the board. And there were some weird things that I didn't like about it, like very nitpicky details of like the fact that like the reasoning for him being in trouble with the media was the fact that he said he didn't like milk, and one of his big sponsors is milk. And like, I'm just like, that is just a really weird thing for like a basis of the story. And there were like some random other things that happened throughout the story where I'm just like, this is just freaking like, it's a little bit off and a little bit weird, like I just wasn't vibing with the whole thing. And even though I still like, I think that a lot of people would like this book, it just for some reason it didn't work for me for one reason or another. But if you did enjoy it, I totally see what you saw in it. So like, I'm not hating on the book, it wasn't for me. So yeah, that is that. But either way, after that, I did also DNF a couple of books. I don't know if I told you that, but either way, I have just a couple of DNFs that I want to quickly share with you. The first book is The Hookup by Kristen Callahan. So I did try giving this book a shot. I think I made it. Let's see. I even like tabbed it a little bit just so I remember. I made it 125 pages into the book before I gave up on it, and I am surprised that I made it that far. I was really trying to give it a shot because I've seen good things about the book, but it really didn't end up working out for me. It, first of all, was insta-love, like way heavy on insta-love, insta-attraction, whatever you want to call it. And then also in the first like 125 pages that I read, there were so many very heavy sex scenes, and there also was like no communication between the characters whatsoever. Like all of a sudden they saw each other from across the room, and then like they gave each other some heavy stares, some heavy panting while in each other's vicinities. And then all of a sudden they jumped into bed together, and then they jumped into bed together again. And then they had maybe like one conversation, and then they slept together again. And I just like was not feeling it. I hate insta attraction. I hate insta love. I hate when it is very heavy on the sex and not heavy on the like build up or the plot line or anything like that. And just there was everything about the first 125 pages really wasn't vibing with me. And I unfortunately had to DNF it because I just didn't want to put myself through the rest of the book. So yeah, for those reasons and a little bit more, I just really did not enjoy this book. So I did not end up finishing it. So yeah, that is The Hookup by Kristen Callahan. But anyway, after that, I did also end up DNFing Praise by Sarah Kate. And I didn't get that far into the book. I got like 75 pages in or so before I decided to DNF it. But I kind of realized like right away that this book was just like wasn't working for me. You're basically following this guy who is the owner of a sex club where they basically like let you, you know, meet people who are like into the same like, you know, sexy, kinky things that you're into. And like, you know, then it's going to be like a very heavy, steamy, whatever you want to call it, romance, like very heavy on the steam sort of romance. And I feel like if you were into the specific kink that the book was actually about, then you would probably really enjoy the book. And I just didn't really realize that I wasn't so into like what this book was about. It was very like submissive, dominant, as well as like a little bit of like a praise kink sort of thing. Like this girl, like, you know, he was going to be very dominant over her, and basically like, you know, she was gonna, you know, do anything that he wanted her, like be very submissive. And I just like, I don't know, all of the details of what I got from the book so far, like I just wasn't really into it at all. So I decided to just like DNF it because I'm like, if I'm not into the characters and I'm not into like, you know, the steaminess of it, then I'm not going to make it through the rest of the book, because that is the majority of what it's actually going to be about. And happens to be, it is also a ex-boyfriend's father's like sort of romance. Like she's gonna end up having a relationship with her ex-boyfriend's dad, and then also it's like a very large age gap of sorts. And there are a lot of good things going for it, and I see why people would enjoy it, but it just was not clicking with me for like every sort of reason. Like all around the board, wasn't liking anything about it. So I just decided to not force myself through the rest. So yeah, that was Praise by Sarah Kate. But anyway, after that, I did also read one of the books that I had put on my September TBR. I just like ended up getting to it very early. Like right after I filmed my September TBR, I ended up just like picking this up, and it didn't end up working out. But either way, that book is Shadow Falls by CC Hunter. So I had said in my September TBR that I was hoping to read this entire companion series via audio through the month of September, but unfortunately, it did not really end up working out for me. So this was actually a reread for me. I did read this a very, very, very long time ago, like maybe like 10 years or so. I can't even remember. But when I was way younger, I read it, and I remember really enjoying it for what it was at the time. But since then, I've gotten much older and I've gotten much pickier, and I just could not get myself into the story. Even though like in theory, I liked the story, I just couldn't really handle the writing style or the sound of the girl that we were following, because you're following like this girl who, I don't know how old she was, probably like 16 or so, but she was just very childish for me. Like, you know, I don't know, just the way that she would say absolutely everything, I just really couldn't handle. And I think I just like, I'm a little bit too old to read this book. So unfortunately, I didn't want to like push myself through the rest of the series, because I already know how it ends. Like, you know, I've read it before in the past, so I wasn't really going to push myself through it if I wasn't really able to handle the writing style or the sound of the main characters. So yeah, I ended up DNFing this book maybe like 25% in or something like that. But yeah, that was that. So anyway, that is my August wrap up. That is all of the books that I read since, you know, the last 2 weeks of August or so. So anyway, if you have read any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. If you enjoyed them, if you haven't enjoyed them, if you plan to maybe pick up any of the books based off of the things that I said about them. So yeah, with that said, leave me a comment down below. And if you enjoyed watching this video, then please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you are not currently subscribed. But either way, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video, because I really do appreciate it. And with that said, until next time, enjoy reading.